We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools.
The voice of a movement.
I have a dream today.
The hope of the future.
We are going to be the generation that dismantles systemic racism, and we will fulfill my grandfather's dream.
One family.
My father did not let up for a moment.
3 generations of leaders.
And neither have we.
Working to fulfill the dream. Fighting for a better world.
Let's fight for the futures of those who will come after us.
And keeping a legacy alive. Here at the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. are on full display. Well, just a few miles from here, at the home of his eldest son, Martin Luther King III, his wife, Andrea, and their daughter, Yolanda. The legacy of Dr. King is far from a memory. It's the foundation of this family's work.
We are challenged to eradicate the last vestiges of racial injustice from our nation.
We are still struggling with the same issues more than 50 years later. We are following in their footsteps on freedom's road.
Yolanda, just last month you spoke at the Washington National Cathedral. That was one of the last places where your grandfather gave his speech. What was it like for you?
Looking back, it was so empowering. I think then I was focused on my speech and really focused on what message I was trying to deliver. When I look back, I'm like, wow, that was amazing. To stand where he was and be the 3rd generation. It's sad that I have to deliver a similar message.
Your daughter just spoke to being a 3rd generation. How do you deal with seeing your daughter still stand and talk about the same issues that your father fought for?
I'm disappointed that they are not new issues that she and young people have to focus on. I'm disappointed that, I don't want to say we failed, but I'm disappointed that our society has not moved further. We should be further, and we're not, yet we're not.
Mr. King, what was it like growing up for you in the King home?
Dad wanted to spend as much time as he could, since he didn't have much time, devoted to his 4 children. In my mind, it was traditional because that's how we were raised. We had an understanding of the work that he was doing because we would have conversations about it on Sunday mornings. He would pray and share our Bible verses, and then we would eat, and he would talk about what he was doing.
How special were those conversations?
So the conversations were more informative as to what was going on as it related to the modern civil rights movement and what he and his team might be engaged in, what campaigns.
At what point were you able to differentiate your dad from the icon?
I don't think it was until after his death. I wish, in retrospect, as an adult, it'd be interesting to have a conversation with him, and particularly as we seem to be repeating ourselves from a historical standpoint. It is said that a people that do not remember their history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Kill the filibuster!
We are involved as a family, and we as a nation, in working to protect, preserve, and expand voting rights. because since last year, 19 states have passed 34 pieces of legislation to make it harder to vote for the black and brown community, for students, for seniors, and that really is undemocratic.
Where do we go from here?
Oh, that's such the quintessential question, and in fact, it was the question that Martin Luther King Jr. left us with. We, frankly, as a family, believe and hope that we as a nation will truly come together as a community. In his last sermon, he talked about the fact that we have made a neighborhood.
We have made of this world a neighborhood, and yet we have not had the ethical commitment to make of it a brotherhood.
And now he called on all of us to make a true brother and our daughter and I would say a true brother and sisterhood. Every generation has a responsibility of continuing to feed the flames of peace and justice and equity, to do our part in the continuation and expansion of humanity.
And Yolanda, you're not allowing your parents to do this alone. We know that you're not old enough to vote just yet. Are you and your friends talking about voting rights?
We do, because we're the future, and these are the futures that these leaders are deciding and determining for us. And so we really want to contribute. And, even though I'm not eligible to vote yet, these issues are not only this issue, but the issue of climate change, the issue of systemic racism, the issue of sexism. All these issues are important issues, and the vote is one of the most important ways to really help diminish these issues, because you want to put in office and support the people who have plans and ways to resolve these issues.
How hopeful are you that things will change by the time you're able to cast your vote?
I feel very hopeful. Sometimes there are moments where I don't feel as faithful, but I think that we are going to get these pieces of legislation passed. I always think of my grandfather. He had perseverance, and eventually he got it done. And so that's what we have to do with this.
I like that word you said, perseverance, right? Because we know that our president and our vice president have said that voting rights would be one of their top priorities.
We will do it together, from guaranteeing the right to vote, ensuring every vote is counted, has always been the most patriotic thing we can do.
President Biden acknowledging tonight that the federal voting legislation he supports will probably not happen this year. Attempts by Senate Democrats to change the filibuster rules in order to pass the voting rights bill failed last night.
Mr. King, do you think that President Biden and this administration have failed Black America?
So I don't want to characterize it as failing. I would say that we have not achieved the mark yet, and the president did commit to getting this done. It's a failure really to democracy, not just to Black people. It's certainly a commitment that was made that has not been fulfilled. We didn't see this necessarily as a sprint. It perhaps is a marathon, and we have to remember that even during Dad's era, the tragedy is that some of the same things that he had to endure, we're still having to endure. So the filibuster was used to stop civil rights legislation. It was even used, I think, maybe to stop voting rights initially. But the fact of the matter is we're not going to let that deter us, because we know that in the long term, we can be victorious. And the victory is not for Black people in this context of voting. It benefits everyone. This benefits democracy.
We have to be clear, too, that these are new restrictions. So last year, we saw an insurrection at our Capitol on January 6th. So we saw the physical attack on our democracy, and now we're seeing the structural attack. I think a lot of times people we can't say that enough, that these are all new laws that have been put in place since we had the mass mobilization and the mass turnout that we saw in 2020.
And Yolanda, I heard you gave a speech recently.
At just 13, I have fewer voting rights than I did the day that I was born.
Can you talk to me about that?
Slowly, our politicians have tried to weaken the Voting Rights Act. When around 2013, I believe, the Supreme Court decided that states didn't need a lot of monitoring and that racism is a thing of the past, so there's really no need for the act. So they weakened it.
Let me just underscore what Yolanda said. So she was born in 2008. In 2013, the Supreme Court basically dismantled the Voting Rights Act, which was the crowning achievement of her grandfather's and so many others' legacy.
Your father had written in a letter from a Birmingham jail. I'm going to quote him. He said, "It is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is devoted to order than to justice."
So, I'll give an even a closer example. Just in the Senate, trying to get voting rights bills done, we had two senators, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, who are moderates. They were the ones who were not willing to change. Oh, we can't change the structures. Oh, we can't change the filibuster. Oh, it's going to cause problems. So the moderates, to some degree, are standing in the way of real progress, is what Dad was speaking to.
Do you think that these senators will have blood on their hands for delaying democracy?
Well, I do think that history will not judge them favorably.
They both owe their voters and the American people an explanation to say how you can support voting rights, which they both say that they do, and not support a clear path to getting it done.
When we come back, more of my sit-down interview with the King family here in Atlanta. Yolanda, if your grandfather were here right now, what would you want to say to him?
Some people feel that we're teaching critical race theory.
Critical race theory, a concept taught in law school that examines systematic racism.
It is a legal doctrine that is not taught in any public school in this country.
Now across the country, critical race theory has become a rallying cry for parents and politicians.
Critical race theory is bigoted.
Who oppose the way American history is taught to children. Another topic that has definitely sparked debates across the country, critical race theory. Topics like slavery, racism, and civil rights that are being taught in schools. What exactly are we doing wrong?
The fact that someone would create something that's not even a real thing, and you create it and make it seem like a thing to really diminish and whitewash and brainwash and change history. I mean, that's sick. That's which goes to show we have even more work to do.
It's an attempt to rewrite American history, to not talk about how the history of how we got to where we are today. And what you also are really saying is that you're against any type of anti-racism curriculum being taught.
And Yolanda, you have a very unique perspective. Do you think your history lessons have told a complete story?
There's been a lot of untold history that my parents have had to tell me about, or history that just many schools don't even offer to you. And I was in shock. I remember the first time my mom told me that there was so much more to Africa, pre-slavery. I just thought that my history started at slavery. And so it was so we've suffered since the beginning of humanity.
Mr. King, what do you think Dr. King would say to hear his only granddaughter even say those words?
Well, he was a realist and he was an idealist. And I think clearly he would be disappointed that we as a society had not advanced further. And for his only grandchild to feel very bad thinking that the history began with slavery, which is what is taught. Every child needs to have an experience to understand what others have gone through, not just what you and your community has gone through, but what every community is going through. And actually, diversity creates a better nation for all of us.
Why do you think that there's been this recent surge in pushback? And it's not just the retelling of Black history, but American history.
We have to go back to 2020. Before 2020, the Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement in most Americans' eyes was an all-Black movement. After the tragic murder of George Floyd, we saw people come together in ways in which we have not seen before. It truly was a diverse movement. What I believe is that whenever there's any type of perceived advancement, you can almost set your clocks to that there will be some type of backlash against that. Books being burned and banned, the rise of anti-Semitism, the attacks on women's rights, because as we are ushering in a new way of being, there are those who are fighting as the old way and systems are dying off.
What does racism look like today?
I mean, racism is in a lot of different forms. We see it when it comes to certain communities today. Zip codes, the insurance rates are higher in communities of color. So racism is structural, and we've got to find a way to dismantle this thing called racism that keeps our society divided. And many people don't think it exists. My dad wanted to eradicate what he called were the triple evils of poverty, racism, and violence. And while we made some strides, we still have a long, long way to go.
Do you think many are trying to erase the legacy of Dr. King?
There is somewhat of an effort to minimize, I wouldn't say dismantle, but just to minimize the impact that this legacy has. There are those from a historian standpoint who want to create a different narrative and change the narrative to that which may not be true. And again, that is something we will not allow. We're not going to allow Dad's legacy, the history, to be written in a different way. We're going to fight all of this tooth and nail.
But what do you say to those who are restless in this fight for equality and justice?
I say that we got to look at the long view. And even if you become exhausted, if you are frustrated, there are days when I'm frustrated. There are days when all of us have been frustrated. But we sometimes have to retreat. You have to meditate. You have to read. You have to fortify yourself and take a break and then come back more ready to be engaged in fighting these battles. Ultimately, we know that we can win. Why? Because we've seen it in the past over and over again.
Yolanda, if your grandfather were here right now, what would you want to say to him?
I may want to kind of stall because I wouldn't want him to see where we are right now, because it's honestly embarrassing in some ways. And I would just say, look, it's a mess right now. We kind of still are where you left. It's almost like no time has passed. People in my generation are doing work, especially after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, are really waking up, and people who have lived in a bubble their whole life, it's finally bursting and they're really seeing what's going on and they're really getting inspired. So many people are waking up.
Coming up, Yolanda's dream for a better world and a call to action for every young American.
Basically, equality and justice is all that I'm asking for. It's not a lot.
Little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
In Dr. King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech, he spoke of a world he wanted for his children. Well, nearly 60 years later, his only grandchild is carrying that legacy into the future. Yolanda, what's your dream?
My dream, it's a lot in the dream. Like, it would be a whole list. I can talk about it all day. My dream is for the world to be better and kids don't have to go through the stuff that many of us have to go through now. It doesn't have to be hard, and that they can be accepted, and that systemic racism doesn't interfere with their life. Basically, equality and justice is all that I'm asking for. It's not a lot.
People hear that message, Yolanda. What do you want them to go out and to do?
Use their platform for good. And when I say that, everyone has a talent, whether that being singing or painting or writing or doing speeches. Not everyone has to be a good speaker. And using that for good. If you want to get involved more, find demonstrations that you're really passionate about around your town. There's all these rallies going on. Bring a group of friends or people who are part of a club that you may have at school and create signs and shirts supporting the cause.
Mr. and Mrs. King, we're in good hands.
Yes, we
Absolutely.
are. Yes, we are.
Yolanda King, turning her grandfather's legacy into next generation dreams. From Atlanta, Phil Tate, News 12.